Respiratory Physiology, and our topic today is gas volumes and gas exchange. Before we get started, I want to say a big thank you to all the people that have been downloading the podcast so far, and I hope you guys have been enjoying listening. To our new listeners, I do recommend that if this is the first time you're covering a topic or these learning objectives are new to you, that you listen to this podcast at normal speed. However, if you've covered the content before and are using it just to revise, then I do think the best bang for buck is to crank up the speed so you can cover as much content as quickly as possible. For your own learning, I do try to keep the LOs that I cover with each topic as similar to the LOs that have been listed in MAC 95 so that you can correlate it later with your own study. However, there has been a recent update with MAC 95, and today the LOs I've chosen with gas volumes and gas exchange might not correlate exactly with what you see with MAC 95. What we'll cover today is the physics of gas flow, the factors that affect airway resistance, talking about lung volumes and lung capacities, describing the alveolar exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then the last learning objective we'll talk about is the diffusion capacity and how to measure it. As always, at the end, we will look at some SAQs that best correlate with these learning objectives, look at the examiner reports, and then analyze that a bit further. So let's get straight into it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So the first LO we're going to talk about is explain the physics of gas flow and the significance of the relationship between resistance and flow in the respiratory tract. So when we talk about airflow, for this to occur, a difference in pressure needs to exist between 2 points. And airflow or flow in general can be related back to Ohm's law. And that's usually the thing you say in most SAQs and most Viva topics. Ohm's law is really important to understand because Ohm's law describes that voltage is equal to current times resistance. Voltage in simple terms is just telling you the potential difference across 2 points. We're just changing that voltage into pressure. So pressure then becomes P1 minus P2. So those are just the two ends where we're measuring pressure. So then we can rearrange that equation to then say that flow is equal to the change in pressure over resistance. When we analyze pressure a bit more, we can say that pressure depends on a couple of things: the rate of flow and the pattern of flow. There are 3 important patterns of flow to understand. The first pattern of flow is laminar flow. Laminar flow occurs at low rates and it has streamlines that are parallel to the sides of a tube. The importance of laminar flow is that it is low in resistance, and if something is low in resistance, it takes less energy to produce. The characteristic thing about laminar flow is that it has something called velocity profile. And if you imagine gas that's flowing as laminar flow in a tube, what that velocity profile demonstrates is that the gas at the center of the tube will flow more quickly compared to the gas that's close to the walls of that tube. The gas that's close to the walls of the tube is nearly stationary, and therefore the velocity of the gas that's in the center is nearly twice as fast as the average gas flow. So it has this characteristic V-shaped pattern when you draw laminar flow in a tube. The relationship between pressure and flow with laminar flow is linear. This is key to remember and different to turbulent flow, which we'll talk about next. So how do we calculate laminar flow? Well, there's an equation that helps to calculate flow known as Purcell equation. And I might be butchering that name, but that's just the way I say it. So Purcell's equation describes that flow is equal to the change in pressure times pi times the radius to the power of 4 divided by 8 times the viscosity times the length of the tube. So it's change in pressure pi times r to the power of 4 divided by 8 NL. And N is just the acronym for viscosity. We usually rearrange that equation to describe resistance when we talk about Purcell's equation, but that can be a trick in some Vivas when people ask you what Purcell's equation is, or Poiseuille's equation is, and Poiseuille's equation actually describes flow, not resistance, but we normally describe it or rearrange it to describe resistance, and that's why we commonly think about it in terms of resistance. So when we rearrange it to describe resistance, we then get that resistance is equal to 8 times the viscosity times the length of the tube divided by pi times radius to the power of 4. If you write down that equation, what you'll find is that the most important factor that contributes to resistance of flow is the radius of the tube. And that's because radius is to the power of 4. So if you were to be asked, what are the factors that increase resistance? We could say that increasing resistance would occur if we increase our viscosity, if we increase our length of the tube, and if we decrease our radius. And decreasing the radius of the tube is going to be the most important factor for changing resistance overall. So you can see how in this simple discussion we've gone from talking about flow and describing Purcell's equation, rearranging that to then talk about resistance. And this is why commonly we then get associated with Purcell's equation with resistance. The most important factor for resistance is the radius of a vessel, because the radius is to the power of 4. So if we halve the radius, we can increase the resistance by 16 times what it was previously. So laminar flow, when you think about it, you can say it has the least resistance, therefore it's important to try to decrease work of breathing. The next type of flow is turbulent flow. So you could imagine that turbulent flow, even the way it sounds, is going to be the opposite. Here, pressure is not proportional to the flow. With laminar flow, we said that if we increase pressure, we'll increase the flow. However, with turbulent flow, if we increase the pressure, it is not proportionally increasing the flow. The pressure is actually non-linearly related to flow. The characteristics of turbulent flow is that you get to see this disorganized, chaotic flow, which has eddy currents, which is flow going around in circles and loops, and you get gas mixing occurring. Turbulent flow also has its own equation that you can use to calculate it, and this is known as a Fanning equation, but most of the time people won't remember this equation. They'll remember the Purcell's equation, which is rearranged to calculate resistance in terms of laminar flow. So what's the clinical significance of turbulent flow? If it requires more energy and there's more resistance for the flow, and it's not as streamlined, we're going to increase our resistance. So turbulent flow is going to increase our work of breathing. You don't see any of that velocity profile, and you don't see any of the characteristics that you see with laminar flow. The key thing to write down in any SAQ with turbulent flow when you're describing it is that you see eddy currents occurring. Then finally, the third pattern of flow is transitional flow. So transitional flow is what its name describes. It's in between laminar and in between turbulent flow. And this is just a pattern where you get to see some mixing and some eddy currents occurring and some streamline occurring as well. So it's just in between. So then how do we tell which way flow is going to go? And this comes to another important equation, which is known as Reynolds number. Reynolds number determines if a flow is going to be laminar or turbulent. And Reynolds number's equation can be written as the diameter of that tube times the velocity of that flow times the density of that gas divided by the viscosity of that gas. So what's different there from the Purcell's equation is that we never had density of a gas being a component of that equation. So what we can say is that if we increase the density, which is the numerator, we're going to increase the Reynolds number. A higher Reynolds number means that there's a higher chance that flow is going to be turbulent. And the number you need to remember is that Reynolds numbers above 2000 increase the likelihood of turbulent flow. Now, some texts will say that that number is exactly above 2000. Some texts will say that if it's less than 2000, your flow is more likely to be laminar. If it's above 2000 to 4000, you can have transitional flow, and above 4000 is turbulent flow. But usually within MCQs that we get in the exam, the classic number is Reynolds numbers above 2000 make it more likely to be turbulent flow. So when we look at that equation of Reynolds number, density is an important factor for determining if flow is going to be turbulent. Density is not an important factor for determining if that flow is laminar. Because when we talked about laminar flow, we talked about Purcell's equation, where we talked about viscosity. And if you think about it, if something is more viscous, it's going to move more slowly. And generally, things that move more slowly are things that are going to be more likely to be remaining in laminar flow. Things that are moving fast and chaotic are going to be more likely to be turbulent flow. So when we relate this back to our functional anatomy, the trachea is large, flow is occurring at high speeds, and here we have the propensity of generating turbulent flow. When we get down to the alveoli, we are increased likelihood of having laminar flow, which is important to decrease work of breathing, as well as increasing our ability to exchange gas across that alveolar capillary interface. So we've talked about our patterns of airflow, and this leads us onto our second LO that we're going to talk about, which is describing the factors affecting airway resistance and how airway resistance may be measured. Airway resistance is the impedance to flow, and we're using that Ohm's law as our building block for all our equations when we talk about flow, resistance, and pressure. So then we can say that flow is equal to the pressure difference, which would be the pressure at the mouth minus the pressure at the alveoli divided by the flow rate. So if the normal difference is 1 millimeter of mercury between the atmospheric pressure and the alveolar pressure that needs to be generated for flow to occur, or 1 centimeter of water, and the normal flow rate is 500 mils per second, or 0.5 liters per second, we can then say that normal airway resistance is approximately 2 centimeters of water per liter per second. And this is important because we don't want airway resistance to be high. We want airway resistance to be low as possible so that our work of breathing is as minimal as possible. So where does the main airway resistance actually occur? You would think that the airway resistance occurs as per your Hagen-Purcell equation, where the radius is the smallest. Where we have our alveoli, the radius is going to be the smallest there. And so we would think our resistance to flow must be the greatest there. But that's not what happens. And the reason is, once we go down into our lower airways and into our respiratory zones, and we'll talk about respiratory zones when we talk about our functional anatomy, but in basic terms, we break down our lungs when we go through the vocal cords down into the trachea into a conducting zone, which is where there's no gas exchange occurring, and a respiratory zone, which is where there can be gas exchange occurring. In the respiratory zone, we get a massive increase in our surface area of the lung, and the surface area can increase to around about 50 to 100 meters squared. This essentially decreases the resistance to flow by increasing the area available for that gas to flow down. The area where airway resistance is actually highest within the airway tree is roughly around about the 6th to 8th generation of bronchi, and that correlates to the mid-sized bronchi. So now looking at the factors affecting airway resistance and this learning objective. We've said the first factor is the physics of the flow itself, aka the type or the pattern of flow. And we've described that the pattern of flow can be either laminar, turbulent, or transitional. And we can use the Reynolds number to see if something's going to be turbulent flow, and a Reynolds number above 2000 indicates increased likelihood of turbulent flow, and the Reynolds number takes in the density of that gas into the equation. When we talk about resistance to the flow, we can use the Hagen-Purcell equation, which calculates flow originally, but we rearrange it to calculate resistance. And when we do that, the numerator is 8 times the viscosity times the length divided by pi times radius to the power of 4. So if we then just look at that equation, we can then figure out what are the other remaining factors that affect airway resistance. So the factors that affect airway resistance has to be the caliber of the airway. If we change the caliber of the airway, we'll change the radius of that airway. So things like having bronchoconstriction will cause the airway radius to decrease. increasing the resistance dramatically to the power of 4. External compression on the airways, such as things like tumor, hemorrhage, and pneumothorax, will cause the change in airway caliber. Normal baseline tone of your smooth muscle, so whether that's a predominance of a parasympathetic drive that's causing bronchoconstriction, or a sympathetic drive by beta-2 receptors which is causing bronchodilation, and normal intramural radius, which can be affected by things inside our airway such as edema, mucus, or foreign body, which will change our caliber of our airway, which will then again change our resistance. So we have factors that are affecting airway resistance, 1 being the pattern of flow, 2 being anything that changes the caliber of the airways, and we can think about the airways being what's inside the airways, what's happening to the muscle tone, and what's happening from outside affecting the airways. The third thing we can talk about is lung volumes, and this is quite simple to understand. If you increase the lung volume, you're essentially increasing the radial traction of the lungs. You're opening up the airway, so again this relates back to the airway diameter. What we see is a proportional decrease in airway resistance as lung volumes increase. So as lung volumes increase, airway resistance decreases, and this is a non-linear decrease. Then we can go back to the equation. What we've got left in the equation when we talk about Hagen-Purcell equation and Reynolds equations is density and viscosity. So increasing the viscosity is going to increase my resistance. Remember, viscosity is in my numerator when we talk about an Hagen-Purcell equation, while density on the other hand can be manipulated by changing the gas formulation. So if we give someone a less dense gas mixture, so say we give them oxygen and helium, this can lead to a less dense gas, and we might want to do that where we want to promote laminar breathing. So in cases where patients have, say someone has severe bronchoconstriction, that bronchoconstriction is leading to an increase in resistance due to a decrease in the radius or the caliber of our airways. They're having higher work of breathing due to that increased resistance, and we want to try to decrease that resistance by minimizing work of breathing. So we want to promote laminar flow. If we make something less dense, then we decrease the likelihood of it being turbulent by decreasing its Reynolds number. Remember, density only relates to Reynolds number and Reynolds equation. It doesn't have anything to do in terms of the Hagen-Purcell equation. However, if we can decrease the ability of, or the tendency of that gas flow to be turbulent, we therefore, by reciprocal, increase the propensity of that gas to be laminar, and laminar flow occurs with less resistance, and therefore it occurs with less work of breathing needed. So this moves us on to talking about airway resistance measurement. There are 2 measurement techniques that I just want to quickly talk about when we talk about measuring airway resistance. The first measurement technique is the body plethysmograph. Remember the basics that airway resistance, or resistance in general, is equal to a change in pressure over flow. We know that a change in pressure is the change in pressure that's going to occur at the mouth minus the alveoli. We know that the flow of normal breathing is going to be approximately 500 mils a second or 0.5 liters a second. So how can we take this knowledge and then convert it into measuring airway resistance? A body plethysmograph essentially puts a patient into a box, and here we use Boyle's law to help calculate airway resistance. Remember, Boyle's law describes that pressure is inversely proportional to volume. So when we put a subject into a closed box, we know that the pressure and the volume are going to change with the patient breathing in and out. The pressure inside the box is atmospheric pressure. When the patient inspires, they change their lung volume, and this therefore changes both the pressure inside their lungs and the pressure in the box. The patient's volumes and flow as they're breathing are calculated, and if we know that the volume that they're breathing and the flow that they're breathing at, we can then use these other parameters to figure out the pressure, and we can then rearrange this to give us the alveolar resistance equation. And this is the most talked about technique when we talk about calculating airway resistance, is the body plethysmograph. You don't need to know the ins and outs of it. You just need to know that it's a box where the patient gets put in. It's using the principles of Boyle's law and figuring out flow and volume and using that to punch it into your alveolar resistance equation. Then there's the interrupter technique, which uses a manometer, which is distal to a shutter. And essentially what it's doing is that it's measuring mouth and alveolar pressure. So during normal respiration, what will happen is that the interrupter technique, as it says in its name, will interrupt breathing throughout a normal respiratory cycle. So it'll interrupt breathing normally around about every 50 to 100 mils, and it will measure the rate of flow before the interruption and after the interruption. It will measure the pressure at the mouth, and it will measure the pressure when flow stops. When flow stops, the pressure that's measured would be equal to the alveolar pressure. Then we will use Ohm's law again, and an equation will be rearranged to give us airway resistance. That's essentially the crux of what you need to know without going too much into that detail. There are other ways that we can also measure airway resistance that we will discuss in later topics when we talk about measurements in respiratory physiology. Now, let's talk about our next learning objective, which is discuss lung volumes and capacities and their measurement and normal values. So to understand this, we must first understand what our normal values are. And so what we have is normal tidal volume, which is roughly around about 6 to 8 mils per kilo, or around about 500 mils in a healthy 70 kilo adult. Our normal respirator is 10 to 15 per minute. So our normal total ventilation can be as high as 5,000 to 7,000 mils per minute. This is different to our alveolar ventilation. Our alveolar ventilation is the ventilation that's going to our respiratory zones of our lungs, so where gas exchange can occur. And for that to be calculated, we take away the ventilation that's occurring in our dead space. And typically in a adult, the dead space is approximately 2 mils per kilo, which would be around about 150 mils in a 70 kilo adult. So our ventilation normally matches our perfusion. There are 4 basic volumes and 4 basic capacities when we talk about lung volumes as a whole. A capacity in simple terms is anything that requires 2 or more lung volumes to calculate it. A lung volume can be calculated by itself, and there are 4 lung volumes. So there is the residual volume, which is the volume of air or gas remaining in the lung after maximal expiration, and this is approximately 15 to 20 mils per kilo. There's the expiratory reserve volume, which is the additional volume of gas that can be expired after normal tidal volume breathing, and this is another 15 mils per kilo. We have our normal tidal volume, which is our normal breathing volume at rest, and this is approximately 6 to 8 mils per kilo. Then we have the inspiratory reserve volume, which is the additional volume that can be inspired at the end of normal tidal volume inspiration. So those are our 4 basic volumes. The 4 basic capacities, and again we said the capacities are 2 or more volumes, are the total lung capacity. So the total lung capacity is the total volume of air left in the lung following maximal inspiration. There's the vital capacity, which is the maximum volume that we can expire after we take a max inspiration. So the difference between vital capacity and the total lung capacity is that vital capacity does not take into account residual volume. Vital capacity is therefore 60 to 70 mils per kilo, while total lung capacity is 70 to 80 mils per kilo. So it has to be more because it incorporates residual volume. We have functional residual capacity, which is key and always talked about. And this is the air left in our lungs at the end of normal tidal volume expiration. So functional residual capacity is a combination of the expiratory reserve volume plus our residual volume. And again, if you forget what makes up a capacity, it has to be 2 or more volumes. So that's a simple way to remember it. Then we have the inspiratory capacity, which is the total volume of air that can be expired from the functional residual capacity. So this would incorporate both the tidal volume and the inspiratory reserve volume. So again, it has to be more than two volumes, and that's the easy way to remember it. Now with simple spirometry, we can measure our tidal volume, we can measure our inspiratory reserve volume, we can measure our expiratory reserve volume, we can measure our vital capacity, but we can't measure our total lung capacity, we can't measure our residual volume, and therefore we can't measure our functional residual capacity. So how do we go about doing this? We have a couple of different measurement techniques. We have classically the gas dilution methods, and then we have the body plethysmograph, which we spoke about when we talked about calculating airway resistance. So within gas dilution methods, there's a couple of different techniques. There's the helium wash-in technique and then the nitrogen washout technique. Commonly, people just remember one or the other, and most commonly, people just remember the nitrogen washout technique. So the nitrogen washout technique is essentially a subject will breathe in 100% oxygen for a few minutes and then wash out all the nitrogen from their lungs. The total amount of nitrogen that's exhaled during this time is measured. Assuming that normal nitrogen concentration in our lungs is approximately 79 to 80%, we can then use an equation which is essentially the concentration and the volume before we started doing anything is equal to the concentration and the volume after we started breathing in the nitrogen. And we can then say that if we knew the concentration of the gas that we were inhaling and the gas that we're exhaling and the volume of the gas that we're expiring out, we can then rearrange this equation to figure out our functional residual capacity. It's quite convoluted, but essentially it's working on the principle that we're measuring what the patient is exhaling, we know what the patient is inhaling, and we're making an assumption of what the patient's normal nitrogen concentration was before they started inhaling an oxygen mixture. So the only thing left that we don't know was what was the volume of the patient's lung before they started inhaling the oxygen mixture. So that's the only variable that we don't know, and if we know all the other variables, we can rearrange for that variable. And what that gives us is what the volume of the lung was before the patient started inhaling plus the FRC, and we can then do some equations and take that away to give us just the FRC. The disadvantage of using a gas dilution method is that only ventilated units of the lungs are measured, because only ventilated units of the lungs are getting that oxygen and expiring that nitrogen. What it doesn't take into account for is diseased lungs and lungs that might have some gas trapping, and so therefore those volumes aren't measured, and therefore we get an underestimation with gas dilution methods. Compared to the body plethysmograph, where the subject is again in that glass-tight box, they're breathing against an occluded airway, and we're measuring the change in alveolar pressure, which is measured at the mouth, and we're using Boyle's law again to figure out the pressure and volume relationship, and then we can use that to calculate FRC. The advantage of this is that with the body plethysmograph, we're able to measure the total lung volume, including the gas that is closed within lung units. So it's more accurate and is the gold standard compared to the gas dilution methods. You could use either method if the patient doesn't have a prominent disease state, but we're typically sending patients away to get these tests done when they have some kind of altered disease state. The reason why patients might not be able to do a body plethysmograph is because it's a glass-tight box. It's quite small, and so therefore it can be quite claustrophobic to some patients. And then patients' body habitus might also limit their ability to get into a glass-tight box and sit on. It's a pretty small seat that they need to sit on as well. So now let's talk about our next learning objective, which is describe the alveolar exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. This kind of moves on to the gas exchange part of this podcast. Initially, we spoke about the gas volume part and the physics of gas flow. Now we're going to be talking more about the gas exchange. Just like when we talked about the physics of gas flow, we talked about the important equations being the Hagen-Purcell equation and the Reynolds equation. We have another important equation that you must kind of imprint into your brain, known as the Fick's law of diffusion. Now, for the transfer of gases to occur across the barrier, especially in the lungs, this occurs via diffusion. And the Fick's law of diffusion describes the rate of diffusion as that it's equal to the area where the diffusion is occurring, the diffusion constant of that substance, the partial pressure gradient, so P1 minus P2 across that membrane, all of that is divided by the thickness of that diffusion membrane. So if that thickness is increased, our rate of diffusion will be decreased, and if any of the numerators are increased, our rate of diffusion will be faster. The diffusion constant can be described as being proportional to the solubility over the square root of the molecular weight, and sometimes this will be substituted into our equation, and commonly you will see that the equation is written as rate of diffusion is equal to A divided by T times solubility divided by square root of molecular weight times the change in partial pressure gradient, so P1 minus P2. When we talk about gas exchange, we can talk about substances that are transferring across the alveolar blood barrier as being either perfusion limited or diffusion limited. Perfusion limited refers to as a substance transfers across from the alveoli into the blood, if the partial pressures equilibrate by the time that it is passed, then it is said to be perfusion limited. However, diffusion limited refers to the partial pressure of the alveoli and the blood not equilibrating by the time the blood has left that circulation. So commonly we say things that are perfusion limited are things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. Things that are diffusion limited are things such as carbon monoxide. Now, oxygen is really unique. It is normally perfusion limited. So again, under normal circumstances, the partial pressure of oxygen will equilibrate between the alveoli and the blood, being 100 millimeters of mercury by the time the blood is about to leave the pulmonary circulation or leave the capillary. However, in certain circumstances, it can become diffusion limited. So normally it takes 0.25 of a second for the equilibration to occur. And the time the blood spends within that alveolar exchange membrane is approximately 0.75 of a second, so 3/4 of a second. So it takes 1/4 of a second or 1/3 of the total time for that equilibration to occur, which leaves a lot of leeway that if things change, such as our cardiac output increases, the time spent in the lungs is less, we have a lot of leeway to still make sure that that equilibration of partial pressures occurs. So under normal circumstances, exercising and increasing our cardiac output will not cause oxygen to become diffusion limited. However, when we have more than one change occurring, then oxygen can start to become diffusion limited. So if we have exercise occurring and at the same time we have some kind of disease process which has increased our thickness of that exchange barrier, we now have more than one thing occurring, and we have the potential for oxygen to go from being a perfusion limited gas to a diffusion limited gas. Another example, when we go into altitude, we're decreasing our atmospheric pressure, we're decreasing our partial pressure of oxygen within our alveoli, so we're decreasing that gradient of P1 to P2, and this, along with, say, if we're exercising at altitude, we are now increasing the chance that oxygen can go from being a perfusion limited gas to a diffusion limited gas. On the other hand, carbon dioxide, we typically say cannot become a diffusion limited gas. And this is because the inherent property of carbon dioxide is that it's 20 times more soluble than oxygen. Because of the ability of carbon dioxide to diffuse so much more quicker, the equilibration between those two pressures occurs so quickly that it's generally said that it can't become a diffusion limited gas, so it stays a perfusion limited gas. Clinically, we will say that changes in diffusion will typically affect oxygen and will very rarely affect carbon dioxide. Now, we mentioned some other gases. So what gases are diffusion limited then? We've said oxygen can become diffusion limited in certain circumstances, so when there's more than one variable, exercise plus altitude, exercise plus disease state plus altitude, those kind of combinations can make it diffusion limited. The other one that's diffusion limited is carbon monoxide. And the relevance of this is that it's commonly used as the measurement tool for diffusion capacity. So diffusion capacity is just another way of saying how to measure how well a gas is transferred by the lung. And this is the last learning objective that we have, which is discuss diffusion capacity and its measurement. The inherent properties of carbon monoxide is that carbon monoxide has much more affinity to bind with hemoglobin than oxygen. And the affinity of it to bind to hemoglobin is around about 200 to 300 times more likely than oxygen. So how does this make it diffusion limited? When carbon monoxide comes in as a gas into the alveoli, it will cross the barrier by diffusion, and then carbon monoxide will continue to bind avidly to hemoglobin. As it binds to hemoglobin, it essentially maintains a gradient, and the rise of carbon monoxide within the blood itself, or the partial pressure rise, will be very minor, and it will take a very, very long time to actually equilibrate to the same concentration. So much so that the partial pressure rises so slowly that we don't even take into account what the partial pressure concentration of carbon monoxide is in the blood, because it's majority binding to the hemoglobin. So to truly measure diffusion capacity, we need to measure diffusion across 3 different areas. The total diffusion is dependent on the diffusion across the alveolar capillary membrane, and then also the diffusion across the blood cell and the reaction it has to hemoglobin. So factors that can affect diffusion capacity can be broken down into the factors that affect the change in membrane surface area, change in membrane diffusion barrier, and then other determinants such as age, sex, exercise, smoking, which can all affect diffusion capacity. So how do we actually measure diffusion capacity? Remember, carbon monoxide is the gas of choice because it binds so avidly to hemoglobin. That large partial pressure gradient remains between the alveoli and the blood. So the way to do it is that there's 3 overall ways. You can use a steady state method, a single breath method, or a rebreathing method. The single breath method is the most frequently used. The steady state method is very simple, whereas the subject breathes essentially a known concentration of carbon monoxide being 0.3%. And it's a good method for children because it doesn't involve them to breath hold, so they don't have to follow commands. The single breath method is the most frequently used, and here the patient has a dilute mixture of carbon monoxide inspired, followed by a 10-second breath hold. Then you get the inspired and expired carbon monoxide, which is measured by an infrared analyzer, and the rate of disappearance of the carbon monoxide from the alveolar gas during the breath hold is calculated to give us the DLCO. So it's the diffusion limiting capacity, or the diffusion capacity for carbon monoxide. The final method, which was the rebreathing method, is essentially where the patient breathes 0.3% of carbon monoxide and 10% of helium from a bag, but it's not commonly used. So the single breath method is the one that's most commonly used, and in children you might see the steady state method instead. And again, the property of carbon monoxide is that it's diffusion limited because it avidly binds to hemoglobin. Normal DLCO is approximately 25 mils of carbon monoxide transferred per minute per millimeters of mercury. And this can increase with exercise due to recruitment and distension of alveoli. So now we're increasing our total capacity where diffusion can occur. And the DLCO can decrease in disease states, such as smoking, and also can have variances with different genders. So typically the DLCO in males is higher than in females. The other caveat with this test is that when the patient is doing the breath hold, other gases can be added, such as helium and other mixtures, and this can give us a general picture of gas volumes and total lung volumes as well that we spoke about previously. So it doesn't have to be just one test for one thing. The gas mixture can have a few different things incorporating it along with the carbon monoxide. So this brings us into our SAQ part of the podcast, which is probably the most high yield. And the first SAQ that I want to talk about that unfortunately gets lumped in with gas volumes is always what are the physiological consequences of decreasing functional residual capacity by 1 litre in an adult. The reason I guess it gets lumped in is because we're talking about lung volumes, and it's been asked more than 3 times now, the last one being in 2015. And the last examiner report stated that you needed to define what FRC was, explain the majority of the following points, including a reduction of FRC, meaning that you would have a decrease in oxygen stores, the change in lung compliance, the change in airway resistance, the effect on worker breathing, the effect on pulmonary vascular resistance, and the effect that FRC falling below closing capacity would have on VQ relationships. I don't think it's a fair question to cover while we're covering this topic because it encompasses everything about respiratory physiology in one question, which is great when you've covered respiratory physiology. However, what I want to add is that actually having a discussion about what FRC is and what's the importance of FRC. So to define FRC, we can say that the FRC is the lung volume at the end of expiration. You need to be at least able to spit out 3 definitions for FRC at any given time. So that's the first one. The second one is that FRC is expiratory reserve volume plus your residual volume. And your third one is that it's the point where the outward recoil of the chest is equal to the inward recoil of the lung. So it's the point where there's balance between, or there's equilibration between those two acting forces. The final thing is that FRC is equal to 30 mils per kilo or 40 mils per kilo if you're standing up. So what's the actual function of FRC? It's an oxygen store which acts as an oxygen reservoir that helps to maintain the alveolar O2 partial pressure to prevent it from falling from breath to breath. So it keeps within plus or minus 3 millimeters of what normal is, even when we're inspiring and expiring. It prevents airway collapse and atelectasis by keeping the airways open and insufflated. It helps to decrease pulmonary vascular resistance because it keeps the airways open. And at FRC is the perfect point where you don't want the airways to be so open that they're collapsing vessels and so closed that they're actually leading to an increase in resistance. It's also the balance where there's decrease in airway resistance. Remember, if we increase lung volumes, we're going to decrease airway resistance, and that's because we're increasing the radius, so we're decreasing the resistance. And FRC is also where people like to breathe, so that's where work of breathing is minimized. And lung compliance is again related to the hysteresis curve that we spoke about, where at FRC our lungs are more likely and it's more easier for them to expand for a change in volume. And we'll certainly talk about FRC a lot more, especially when we get into the applied respiratory physiology SAQs, and then it'll hopefully make a lot more sense how it encompasses all the components of the respiratory physiology topic. With regards to the other SAQs that we've covered today, when we spoke about airway resistance, there's been 2 SAQs that have been asked specifically about the factors that affect airway resistance. They've both been asked back in 1999 and in 2003, and the question was, describe the factors that affect airway resistance. The examiner report here stated that what they wanted was a good definition of airway resistance involving Ohm's law, which we've kind of talked about ad nauseum today, talking about the SI units. So the SI units that we've described is that normal airway resistance is 2 centimeters of water per liter per second, and giving the reason why that value actually comes from. Also, they wanted to talk about how airway resistance is affected by the upper airways and lower airway tracts, and the relationship between lung volumes and airway resistance, which is best demonstrated graphically. So again, it's a non-linear relationship which shows that increasing lung volumes decreases airway resistance. And again, this is back to the concept of the Hagen-Purcell equation and looking at the change in radius which leads to a decrease in airway resistance. The other factors that were important, we're talking about laminar and turbulent flow, and also talking about Reynolds number. So the simple way that I've classified this answer is a brief definition of airway resistance as that airway resistance is the impedance to flow, and the equation being resistance is equal to pressure gradient over flow, and a pressure gradient being the mouth pressure minus the alveolar pressure, what normal airway resistance is, and then just briefly giving the clinical context that most of the airway resistance occurs at the 6th to 8th bronchi. Subsequent to that, minimal airway resistance occurs because of the increase of surface area for gas exchange. The factors that affect the airway resistance when we're talking about the lower respiratory tract, so things below the vocal cords, we can think about the pattern of flow, so the physics of flow, so whether the flow is laminar, turbulent, or transitional, and then we can incorporate Reynolds number in there and talk about how Reynolds number incorporates density, while the Hagen-Purcell equation does not have density with it. The important number to remember with Reynolds number is, again, above 2000 increases the likelihood of it being turbulent flow, and then somewhere around that 2000 mark is also where we get that transitional flow. Then we can go into the factors that are described as per the Hagen-Purcell equation. So we can talk about factors that affect radius, so the caliber of the airways, and this can be things that are causing compression from outside, things that are changing the smooth muscle tone, which can be inherently intrinsic, such as the parasympathetic or sympathetic tone, and then things that are within the vessels themselves or within the airway themselves. So these are things like mucus, foreign bodies. The other factors from the Hagen-Purcell equation are viscosity, and then from the Reynolds number is the density that we've spoken about. We can talk about lung volumes, and then we can also finish up by talking about the airway resistance up in the upper airways. So this will be things like obesity and OSA causing a decrease in airway flow and decreasing the radius for the passage for airflow to occur, and therefore increasing airway resistance, and normal physiological changes in airway tone that occur when we sleep, such as what we experience when we're in REM sleep, where there's a decrease in tone, which increases the propensity for patients to have sleep apnea as well. Then the last SAQ from the ANZCA exam that touched on the topics we covered today was in 2003 again, which was explain the difference between perfusion limitation and diffusion limitations in the transfer of gas between alveoli and pulmonary capillary. Outline the factors that determine whether gas transfer is perfusion or diffusion limited. As per the examiner report, the main points that were expected was a definition and explanation of both perfusion limitation and diffusion limitations, as well as a description of the factors included in Fick's law of diffusion. It was expected that a candidate would be able to demonstrate that or describe that the diffusion limitation means alveoli and pulmonary capillary partial pressure equilibration is incomplete, which goes back to the definitions at the start that they wanted. It was also expected you would be able to talk about the factors that affect whether a gas is perfusion or diffusion limited, and those factors being the solubility of a gas, the partial pressure gradient, and the transit time of blood through the alveoli. And that's commonly a forgotten one because it's not in your Fick's law of diffusion or rate of diffusion equation. And you have to remember that the rate of blood flow is an important factor because for equilibration to occur, typically with oxygen, it requires a quarter of a second, and the amount of time blood is in interface with the alveoli, and a normal pass is 3/4 of a second. So 1/3 of the time is normally required to equilibrate, which means that we can increase our blood flow, our cardiac output by 3 times without causing any kind of change in our ability of oxygen to equilibrate. The examiner report also offered extra points if you were able to correctly categorize carbon dioxide and oxygen into its categories of whether it was being perfusion or diffusion limited. And then additional marks were gained if you could talk about the significance of binding of gas to hemoglobin, and here talking about carbon monoxide and how it is useful in measuring the diffusion limitation of a patient. So I think if you're structuring a way to answer this question, you just start off by saying that diffusion of the gas is determined by Fick's law. You quickly write down Fick's law and then you give a good definition for perfusion and diffusion limited. And really the key in that definition is saying which one is equilibrated and which one is not equilibrated. Then you can add in a graph which shows the time course of blood across the alveolar wall. On the y-axis you have different types of gases and the partial pressure of this and how long it takes to equilibrate. So oxygen would equilibrate in 0.25 of a second. Nitrous oxide will equilibrate very quickly and rapidly. Carbon monoxide will not equilibrate, so it'll just have a very slow rise and won't equilibrate at all. And then carbon dioxide equilibrates quickly as well. Then you can go into factors that affect how a gas is perfusion or diffusion limited, and oxygen is always a great example. The other part where I would spend time in this question is talking about carbon monoxide and the properties that make it a diffusion limited gas, and then what it is about these properties that make it suitable for the measurement of the diffusion capacity. So I think these are the main questions that have been asked about gas volumes and gas exchange. And again, we'll talk about FRC questions further on in Applied Respiratory Physiology podcast. There is one question from the CICM exam that hasn't been asked, which can be incorporated into this. And it was asked in 2012, where the question was, draw a normal spirometry trace in a young adult, being 20% of the mark, and describe the changes seen in spirometry in pregnancy at term, 80% of the mark. So the reason I bring up this question from CICM is because you could see it being asked in the ANZCA exam quite easily. And the key things you want to note is that minute ventilation is increased in pregnancy. 40% of the total 50% increase in minute ventilation is due to an increase in tidal volume. So your tidal volume would be a lot higher on that spirometry trace. Your FRC is decreased by 20%, so subsequently that'll be smaller. And because your FRC is decreased, your expiratory reserve volume and your residual volume will decrease. The total lung capacity is also therefore decreased. One thing that's a bit weird that's increased is your inspiratory capacity. That, along with your tidal volumes, are the two things that are increased on that trace. And then you could also incorporate the reasons for why those changes occur. So there's the cephalic displacement of the diaphragm, there's the increase in the progesterone changing your minute ventilation curve, and you could see how this question would get a lot of extra marks from talking about the physiology of pregnancy, and that's how it was distributed. 80% of the marks were for this. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this podcast. It's a long podcast that we've spoken about, but there's essentially three key things that are really important to get from gas volumes and gas exchange. The first one being the physics and the pattern of flow. So understanding laminar, turbulent and transitional flow, and understanding the different characteristics. So knowing terms like velocity profile, eddy currents, and chaotic unorganized flow. And within that, we talk about equations. So the Hagen-Purcell equation, how that's rearranged for resistance, and then the Reynolds number equation. Within volumes, we talk about how there are 4 key lung volumes and 4 key capacities. And if you ever forget, you all can always remember that a capacity is the combination of one or more volumes. And so therefore, it's quite easy to remember. And the most important capacity that we talk about, especially in the anaesthetic field, is FRC, and how this is related to compliance, vascular resistance, work of breathing, airway resistance, and VQ matching. Finally, we have the importance of diffusion and understanding how gases are diffused across the alveoli capillary interface and how this relates to the Fick's law of diffusion. So that concludes our podcast for today, and we'll be back next time talking about functional anatomy of the respiratory tract. So till then, thanks for listening.